Why do you believe that thing you believe? No, I'm serious. Think about it. Right now, in your head, you've got an opinion. Maybe it's about politics. Maybe it's about how smart you are. Maybe it's about whether that person really likes you, and you're sure about it. You feel certain. But here's the thing. How do you know you didn't just make it up? How do you know your brain isn't playing a trick on you this very moment, convincing you of something that isn't true? See, I've spent my whole life in physics, and you might think physics is safe. Numbers, equations, hard facts. But I'm going to tell you something that might surprise you. Some of the biggest mistakes in the history of science weren't made by stupid people. They were made by brilliant people, Nobel Prize winners, the best minds in the world. And you know why? Because they wanted something to be true. They believed it so hard that they bent the world to fit their belief. And here's the terrifying part. They didn't know they were doing it. By the end of our time together today, you're going to understand how your own mind works against you. You're going to see the tricks it plays. And if you're lucky, if you really pay attention, you might learn how to catch yourself in the act of fooling yourself, because that's the hardest thing in the world to do. Let me tell you about the first principle, the most important thing I know. Ready? Here it is. You must not fool yourself, and you are the easiest person to fool. I'll say it again because it matters that much. You must not fool yourself, and you are the easiest person to fool. Not other people, not con men or politicians or used car salesmen. You are your own easiest mark, your own best target. Your brain is running a con on you right now, and it's been doing it your whole life. Now, why should that be? Think about it from nature's perspective. Your brain didn't evolve to find the truth. It evolved to keep you alive long enough to have children. That's it. Truth was never the goal. Survival was the goal. And sometimes a little self-deception helps you survive. If you're slightly overconfident, you might take risks that pay off. If you believe you're more attractive than you are, you might approach a mate who turns out to like you. Nature doesn't care if you're accurate. Nature cares if you reproduce. But here's the problem. In science, and in trying to understand the world, self-deception is fatal. It destroys everything. If you believe something because you want it to be true, you're not doing science anymore. You're doing something else, something dangerous, something I call cargo cult science. Let me tell you what I mean by that. In the South Seas, during the war, there were islands where the natives had never seen modern technology before. Then suddenly, American soldiers showed up. They built airstrips, control towers, and planes started landing with all kinds of wonderful things. Food, tools, medicine, cargo. The natives watched this happen and they thought, well, this is pretty good. We'd like that to keep happening. But then the war ended. The soldiers left. The planes stopped coming. So what did the natives do? They figured maybe they could make it happen again. They cleared areas to look like runways. They built wooden huts that looked like control towers. They carved headphones out of wood and wore them. They sat in their towers and waved their arms like they'd seen the controllers do. They did everything right. The form was perfect. It looked exactly like it was supposed to look, but the planes didn't land. See, they had the outward appearance of the thing without understanding what made it work. They didn't know about radio signals or navigation or the whole system of logistics that made those planes appear. They just copied what they could see. And copying what you can see isn't the same as understanding. Now, you might laugh at this. Wooden headphones, that's absurd. But I'm going to tell you something. There are scientists right now at major universities getting grants and publishing papers who are doing the same thing. They have the form of science without the substance. They have statistics and peer review and laboratory equipment. They write papers that look scientific. But the planes don't land. Their results don't replicate. Their theories don't predict anything new, and they don't even know they're doing it wrong. Why? Because they've fooled themselves. They've started believing something, and then they've arranged all their work to prove what they already believe. That's not science. That's rationalization dressed up in a lab coat. Let me give you an example, a real one from the history of physics. Robert Millikan was a brilliant man, won the Nobel Prize. He did an experiment to measure the charge of an electron using tiny drops of oil. Very clever experiment. He watched the drops fall through the air, then turned on an electric field to make them rise, and from that he could calculate how much charge each drop carried. Beautiful idea. He got an answer, and his answer was wrong. Just a little bit wrong, but wrong. The number he published was too low by about 0.5%. Now, 0.5% doesn't sound like much, but in precision physics it matters. And the reason he got it wrong was because he used an incorrect value for the viscosity of air. That's not his fault. Nobody knew the right value at the time. But here's the interesting part. Here's what keeps me up at night. After Millikan published his number, other people started measuring the electron's charge too. Different experiments, different methods. And if you plot all their results over time, something very strange happens. The values creep up, little by little. One guy gets a number a bit higher than Millikan's. The next guy gets a number a bit higher than that. And they keep creeping up, slowly, over years, until they finally settle on the correct value, which is noticeably higher than what Millikan measured. Now wait, think about this. Why didn't someone just immediately get the right answer? Why did it take years for the numbers to drift up? What was happening? I'll tell you what was happening. Those scientists were fooling themselves. They'd measure their oil drops, do their calculations, and get a number. And if the number was close to Millikan's, they'd say, good, that makes sense, and they'd publish it. But if their number was way higher than Millikan's, they'd say, that's suspicious. Maybe I did something wrong. Let me check my equipment. Let me look for errors. And they'd find reasons to throw out the high numbers. They weren't cheating. They weren't lying. They genuinely believed they were being careful scientists. But they had a number in their head, Millikan's number, and anything that disagreed with it too much seemed like a mistake. So they eliminated the data that would have given them the right answer. This pattern has a name now. Scientists call it anchoring. Once you have a number in your head, all your subsequent judgments get pulled toward that number. It's like a gravitational field for your thoughts. Even when you're trying to be objective, even when you're doing your best work, that anchor is bending your thinking. And the funny thing is, Millikan himself might have done something similar. When you look at his laboratory notebooks, there are comments in the margins, little notes saying things like publish next to some measurements and something wrong next to others. Now, maybe he had good scientific reasons for those judgments. Maybe some of those drops really were problematic. But maybe, just maybe, he was unconsciously selecting the data that gave him a cleaner result, the data that made his answer look more certain than it really was. We can't read his mind. We don't know for sure. But this is the danger. This is what self-deception looks like in practice. Not villains twirling their mustaches and deliberately faking data. Just ordinary people, good people, careful people, who subtly tilt the playing field without even realizing they're doing it. This is the hardest thing about fooling yourself. You don't know you're doing it. You feel like you're being careful. You feel like you're being scientific, but you've already decided what the answer should be, and you're unconsciously steering toward it. Now, let me give you another example from a completely different field, psychology. This one really gets me worked up. There have been many experiments running rats through mazes, all kinds of mazes. For decades, people have been studying how rats learn. And in 1937, a man named Young did something very interesting. He had a corridor with doors along both sides. Rats came in through one side, food was on the other side. And he wanted to train the rats to always go to the third door down from where they started. Simple enough, right? Teach a rat to count to 3. But Young found something strange. The rats kept going to the same door every time, even when he changed things around. They weren't counting. They weren't learning what he thought they were learning. So he started asking, how do they know which door is which? He painted all the doors exactly the same. Still they knew. He changed the smells with chemicals. Still they knew. He covered the corridor so they couldn't see the lights in the room. Still they knew. Finally, he discovered that they were listening to the sound the floor made when they ran over it. Different parts of the corridor sounded different under their feet. He had to put the whole thing on sand to eliminate that cue. And then, at last, the rats had to actually learn the task. They couldn't cheat anymore. Now, this is a beautiful piece of science. This is how you do an experiment. You systematically eliminate every possible alternative explanation until you've actually isolated what you're trying to study. Young discovered all the things you have to do to discover something about rats. And do you know what happened after that? I looked into it. The next experiment that was published didn't mention Young's work. The one after that didn't mention it either. Nobody used his methods. They just went right on running rats in the same old way, ignoring all the things that could contaminate their results. And Young's papers faded into obscurity. Why? Because he didn't discover anything about rats. He discovered how to discover things about rats. And that's not interesting to people who've already decided they know how to do their experiments. That's not interesting to people who've already fooled themselves into thinking their methods are good enough. This is cargo cult science. It has the form of science. Experiments with rats, published papers, statistics, peer review, all the right elements. But something essential is missing. The planes don't land. And you know what's tragic? It's not just psychology. It happens everywhere. Education, research, nutritional studies, economics, sociology, any field where the phenomena are complex, where there are many variables, where it's hard to do controlled experiments. Those are the fields where cargo cult science thrives. I remember talking to someone about educational research once. They were very excited about some new teaching method that had been proven to work. So I asked a few questions. How many students were in the study? How were they assigned to the different groups? Was it random, or did teachers choose? How did they measure learning? Did they account for the fact that kids with motivated parents might do better regardless of teaching method? And you know what I found? The answers to these questions were either vague or missing. The study had the trappings of scientific research, numbers and graphs and p-values. But when you looked closely, the experimental design was full of holes. There were a dozen ways the results could be explained by factors other than the teaching method. This is why I get worried when someone tells me that studies prove something in these complex fields. Not because the researchers are dishonest. Most of them are doing their best. But because the temptation to fool yourself is so strong, and the opportunities to do so are so many. When you're studying something as messy as human behavior, you can almost always find a way to see what you want to see. So what is that missing thing? What makes real science different from the cargo cult version? I'll tell you. It's a kind of integrity, a principle of scientific thought that corresponds to utter honesty. It's not just about not lying. Advertising isn't lying, exactly, but it's not science either. When someone tells you their cooking oil doesn't soak through food, they're telling you the truth, but they're leaving out the fact that no cooking oil soaks through food at normal temperatures. They're creating an implication that isn't there. Scientific integrity is different. It means you report everything that might make your results invalid, not just the things that support your conclusion. Everything. The stuff that might be wrong. The alternative explanations you can think of. The experiments you tried that didn't work. You have to bend over backwards to give people the information they need to prove you wrong. I'll give you an example of what this looks like in practice. Suppose I do an experiment and I get a result that supports my theory. A cargo cult scientist would write up the paper and say, look, my theory is correct. But a real scientist would do something different. A real scientist would write in the paper, here's my result. But there are several things that might make it unreliable. First, my equipment might have had this particular problem. Here's how I checked for it, but I couldn't completely rule it out. Second, there might be this confounding variable that I couldn't control for. Third, my sample size was limited, so the statistical significance could be weaker than it appears. Fourth, here are some alternative explanations that are also consistent with my data. I've tried to rule them out, but here are the ones I couldn't eliminate completely. You see how different that is? The real scientist is actively trying to undermine their own work. They're giving you the weapons to attack them. They're saying, if I'm wrong, here's how you could find out. That's incredibly hard to do. Your whole career might depend on this result. Your funding, your reputation, and you're supposed to sit there and help people see the flaws in your work? Every fiber of your being resists this. Your brain screams at you, don't do it, you'll look weak, you'll lose the argument. But that's exactly why it matters. That resistance, that reluctance to help people prove you wrong, that's where self-deception lives. That's the enemy you're fighting. Think about that for a second. You spend months or years working on something, you think you've discovered something important, and then you have to spend just as much effort trying to tear it down. You have to actively look for ways your result might be wrong. That's a very hard thing to do. Your ego is invested. Your career is invested. And your brain, your own brain that's been fooling you this whole time, is going to resist. It's going to say, come on, you know you're right. Don't be so hard on yourself. But that voice is the enemy. That voice is cargo cult thinking. Real science means fighting against your own mind. Let me explain this a different way. Suppose I claim that I can teach a dog to do arithmetic. You're skeptical, but I invite you to my house to see for yourself. I write 2 + 3 on a piece of paper and show it to the dog. The dog barks 5 times. Amazing. I do it again with different numbers. Every time, the dog barks the right answer. Now, a cargo cult scientist might be convinced. Look at the results. The dog gets the right answer. What more do you want? But a real scientist would start asking uncomfortable questions. Can someone else write the problems? Does the dog still get them right if you're not in the room? What if someone the dog has never met runs the experiment? Maybe the dog isn't reading the numbers at all. Maybe he's picking up cues from you. Maybe you're unconsciously nodding or breathing differently when he reaches the right number. This is what really happened with a famous horse in Germany named Clever Hans. The horse seemed to do arithmetic by tapping his hoof the right number of times. For years, people were amazed. Scientists examined him and declared the phenomenon genuine. But eventually someone thought to test the horse when the questioner didn't know the answer, when the questioner was hidden behind a screen, when the horse couldn't see anyone who knew the answer. And guess what? The horse couldn't do it anymore. He'd been reading tiny, unconscious cues from the people around him. The people who believed in Clever Hans weren't stupid. They were fooling themselves. They wanted the horse to be magical, so they didn't think to test the one thing that mattered. Can he do it when he can't see you? This is what I mean when I talk about being the easiest person to fool. The Clever Hans investigators thought they were being rigorous. They examined the horse carefully. They looked for fraud. But they didn't think to ask the right question because they didn't really want to know the answer. They wanted the magic to be real. Now wait, you might say. I'm not a scientist. Why should I care about all this? This is all about experiments and laboratories. What does this have to do with regular life? And the answer is everything. Because you're running experiments all the time. You're testing ideas about the world constantly. Should I trust this person? Is this relationship working? Am I good at my job? Am I making the right choices? Every day you're gathering evidence and drawing conclusions. And every day your brain is lying to you about what that evidence means. Let me give you some everyday examples. You buy a new car. It costs a lot of money. And suddenly, everywhere you look, you see other people driving the same car. You think, wow, this must be a really popular model. But actually, those cars were always there. You just didn't notice them before because they weren't relevant to you. Now that you own one, your brain highlights every matching car and filters out the others. This is called the frequency illusion, and it's harmless with cars, but it affects everything you think about. Or here's another one. You read a horoscope. It says you're going to have challenges with communication this week. And guess what? During the week, you notice every miscommunication. Every time someone doesn't understand you, every awkward conversation, and you think, wow, that horoscope was right. But you don't notice all the conversations that went perfectly. You don't count the times when communication was easy. Your brain selectively remembers the hits and forgets the misses. This is how psychics work, by the way. They make vague predictions that could apply to anyone, and your brain does all the work of making them seem specific and accurate. You fool yourself into thinking they have special powers. Here's another example, a more serious one. You have a friend, and you notice that your friend has been acting cold lately, not calling as much, making excuses not to see you. So you think, she must be upset with me about something. And once you think that, you start noticing more evidence. Remember that time she seemed short with you on the phone? Remember when she didn't laugh at your joke? It all fits together. But does it? Or are you just filtering the world through your theory? Maybe she's been stressed at work. Maybe she's going through something that has nothing to do with you. Maybe you're noticing the times she seems cold and ignoring all the times she was warm and friendly. You don't know. But your brain has already decided, and now it's rearranging your memories to match. This is what psychologists call confirmation bias, and it's one of the most powerful forces in human thinking. Once you believe something, you notice the evidence that supports it, and you ignore or discount the evidence that contradicts it. You're not doing this on purpose. You don't know you're doing it. Your brain is just naturally organized to protect its beliefs from attack. Let me show you how powerful this is. Let's do an experiment right now. Think of someone you know, someone you like. Got them in your mind? Good. Now I want you to think of evidence that this person is trustworthy. Examples of times they've been honest with you. Times they've come through when you needed them. Easy, right? The memories pop up without effort. You probably thought of 3 or 4 examples in a few seconds. Now think of evidence that this same person might not be trustworthy. Times they might have shaded the truth. Times they let you down. Harder, isn't it? Even if those examples exist, they don't come as easily. Your brain has to work to find them. And if you're like most people, even when you find them, you start making excuses. Oh, that time didn't really count because of the circumstances. That was different. This is your brain protecting its beliefs in real time. You can actually feel it happening if you pay attention. The smooth, effortless flow of confirming evidence. The struggle and resistance when you try to find disconfirming evidence, that asymmetry is confirmation bias in action. And it's not just about beliefs, it's about your whole sense of who you are. Your identity is a story you tell yourself. And your brain works very hard to keep that story consistent. If you think of yourself as a good driver, you'll remember the times you drove well and forget the times you nearly hit someone. If you think of yourself as smart, you'll remember your insights and forget your mistakes. The story stays smooth and flattering, and you never even notice the editing. Let me tell you something I've learned about myself. When I'm working on a physics problem and I get stuck, there's always a temptation to fudge a little bit. To say, well, it's probably okay to assume this, or that term is probably small enough to ignore. And sometimes those assumptions are valid, but sometimes they're just a way to make the answer come out the way I want it to. The hardest thing in the world is to catch yourself doing this, because it feels like honest reasoning. It feels like you're being practical and making reasonable approximations. But underneath, there might be wishful thinking pushing you toward a particular result. You have to constantly ask yourself, am I doing this because it's right or because it's convenient? Am I simplifying because the physics justifies it or because the algebra is getting too hard? I don't always know the answer. That's the scary part. I can't always tell when I'm fooling myself and when I'm genuinely being rigorous. But at least I know to ask the question. At least I know the danger is there. Now, let me give you a thought experiment. I want you to really imagine this one. It's important. Suppose you come up with a brilliant new theory. It explains everything beautifully. All the pieces fit together. You're very excited. You show it to your friends and they're impressed. You write it up and submit it to a journal. And then someone points out a problem. There's a piece of evidence that doesn't fit your theory. What do? Well, you could say, interesting. My theory must be wrong. Back to the drawing board. But that's psychologically very difficult. You've invested a lot in this theory. You've told people about it. You've staked your reputation on it. Your brain doesn't want to give it up. So here's what often happens instead. You start coming up with reasons why that piece of evidence doesn't really count. Maybe the measurement was wrong. Maybe there were unusual conditions. Maybe there's some factor that wasn't accounted for. And you know what? Sometimes these objections are valid. Sometimes the evidence really is problematic. But sometimes you're just making excuses because you don't want to be wrong. How do you tell the difference? That's the hard part. That's the whole game. And the only way I know to do it is to ask yourself this question. Would I make the same objections if the evidence supported my theory? If someone presented evidence that confirmed your theory, would you scrutinize it just as carefully? Would you look for experimental errors? Would you demand that every possible alternative be eliminated? Or would you just accept it and move on? The answer, if you're honest, is that most people would accept the confirming evidence without much examination. It agrees with what they believe, so it must be right. But the contrary evidence, the stuff that challenges their belief, that gets subjected to intense scrutiny, every possible flaw is magnified. This is backwards. If you want to find the truth, you should be harder on the evidence that agrees with you than the evidence that disagrees. Because the evidence that agrees with you is what your brain wants to accept. That's where the self-deception is most likely. Let me put this another way. Suppose a friend tells you something you want to hear, that you're talented, that your idea is brilliant, that you were right in that argument. How carefully do you examine that praise? Do you probe for details? Ask what specifically made them think so? Question whether they might be wrong? Probably not. You just accept it. Feels good. Must be true. Now suppose a different friend tells you something you don't want to hear, that you made a mistake, that your work has a problem, that you were actually wrong in that argument. Now you become a detective. What exactly do they mean? What's their evidence? Maybe they don't understand the full picture. Maybe they're biased. Maybe they're just jealous. Same evidence, different treatment. Compliments get accepted at face value. Criticisms get interrogated until they break down or you find a flaw. This is exactly backwards from what finding the truth requires. A few years ago, I started a practice. Whenever someone criticizes my work, I try to treat it the same way I'd treat a compliment. I try to accept it first, sit with it, see what truth might be in it. Only later do I allow myself to evaluate whether the criticism is fair. It's hard. My ego screams at me the whole time. But it's made me better at catching my own mistakes. Now, I want to be clear about something. I'm not saying you should never believe anything. I'm not saying you should be paralyzed by doubt. That's just as bad as being too certain. You have to make decisions. You have to commit to ideas. A scientist who never believes anything can't do science. You need some confidence in your theories to pursue them. But there's a difference between confidence and certainty. I have approximate answers and possible beliefs and different degrees of certainty about different things. I'm not absolutely sure of anything. I think it's much more interesting to live not knowing than to have answers which might be wrong. See, doubt is not something to be feared. Doubt is the beginning of wisdom. If you already know the answer, there's no need to gather any evidence. You're done. You've closed your mind. But if you maintain a little uncertainty, you keep looking, you keep learning, you stay open to the possibility that you might be wrong. And here's the beautiful thing about science when it's done right. It has a self-correcting mechanism. If I fool myself and publish something wrong, eventually other people will check it. They'll do the experiment again. They'll catch my mistake. Nature doesn't care what I believe. Nature just does what it does, and if my theory doesn't match, someone will eventually notice. But this only works if everyone plays fair, if everyone reports their methods honestly, if everyone tries to disprove their own theories, if scientists fudge their data, if they hide their methods, if they only publish the results that work, then the whole system breaks down. We lose our ability to distinguish true science from cargo cult science, and we end up with wooden headphones, waving at the sky, wondering why the planes won't land. Let me tell you about something that happened at a major laboratory. A physicist was doing an experiment comparing heavy hydrogen with regular hydrogen. To interpret his results, he needed to know what regular hydrogen would do in the same apparatus. But he didn't want to run the regular hydrogen experiment himself. It would take too much time. The machine was expensive and heavily scheduled, so he used data from someone else's experiment, done on different equipment. Do you see the problem? If you're comparing two things, you have to compare them under the same conditions. If you use data from different equipment, there might be systematic differences between the machines that contaminate your comparison. You can't trust the result. And why did this happen? Because the people in charge of the laboratory wanted new results. They wanted things that would look good in reports, things that would justify more funding. Running a control experiment on regular hydrogen wouldn't produce any new results. We already know what hydrogen does, so it seemed like a waste of time. But without that control, you don't know if your result is real or just an artifact of the equipment. You might be fooling yourself. The whole experiment might be meaningless. This is how institutions can corrupt science. The pressure to produce flashy results, the competition for funding, the need to publish or perish. All of these forces push scientists toward cutting corners, toward not doing the careful work that makes results reliable, and the scientists themselves might not even realize what's happening. They think they're being efficient. They think they're adapting to practical constraints. But they're really just abandoning the integrity that makes science work. Let me tell you something else about institutions. They create shared delusions. When everyone around you believes something, it becomes almost impossible to question it. I've been in rooms full of smart people where everyone agreed about something that was completely wrong, and the social pressure to go along was enormous. If you spoke up and said, "Wait, I think there's a problem here," people would look at you like you were crazy, like you just didn't understand. And sometimes you'd start doubting yourself. Maybe I'm the one who doesn't get it. Maybe everyone else sees something I don't. But sometimes everyone else is just fooling themselves, collectively. The shared belief reinforces itself. People repeat it to each other. They cite each other's agreement as evidence that the belief must be correct. And it becomes this self-sustaining bubble that resists all attempts to pop it. This is why independent thinkers are so valuable. Someone who's willing to say the emperor has no clothes. Someone who trusts their own judgment even when everyone disagrees. These people are annoying. They slow things down. They ask inconvenient questions. But without them, organizations drift into comfortable delusions that eventually crash against reality. Let me explain something else. There's a common misconception I want to address. People often think that smart people are less likely to fool themselves, that intelligence protects you from self-deception, that if you just think hard enough, you'll see through your own biases. This is wrong. In fact, it might be exactly backwards. Smart people are often better at fooling themselves, not worse. Why? Because they're better at coming up with plausible-sounding reasons for what they want to believe. They can construct elaborate rationalizations. They can find subtle arguments that support their position. Their intelligence becomes a weapon they use against themselves. A simple person who believes something silly can't defend it very well. You can poke holes in their reasoning pretty easily, but a brilliant person who believes something silly can tie you in knots. They can make bad ideas sound good. They can explain away any counter-evidence. Their own intelligence becomes a trap. I've seen this many times in physics. Very smart people who've committed to a wrong idea and who use their brains to defend it rather than to question it. The smarter they are, the longer it takes them to see their mistake, because they keep finding clever reasons why they must be right. So intelligence is not enough. What you need is intellectual honesty. The willingness to see your own ideas as provisional, the ability to hold your beliefs loosely enough that evidence can change them. And that's a character trait, not an IQ score. Now let me tell you about a different kind of self-deception, the kind that comes from wanting to please other people. Suppose you're a student, and your professor has a theory, and suppose you do an experiment that doesn't quite fit the theory. What do? Do you report exactly what you found? Or do you massage the numbers a little bit, interpret the results charitably, find some way to make your data consistent with what your professor believes? I'm not talking about outright fraud here. I'm talking about something subtler, the selection of which data points to include, the choice of how to analyze ambiguous results, the framing of conclusions. There are many places in scientific work where judgment calls have to be made, and those judgment calls can be influenced by what you think other people want to hear. And it's not just professors. It's grant agencies, journal editors, your colleagues, your spouse. Everyone around you has expectations, and there's tremendous pressure to meet those expectations. Even if nobody explicitly tells you what results to get, you know what results would make people happy, and that knowledge seeps into your work. I was lucky. When I was young, I had a father who taught me to question authority. He didn't have any scientific training, but he had the right instincts. When we'd see a bird doing something, he'd ask me what I thought the bird was doing and why. And then he'd ask, how could we test that idea? What would we expect to see if it were true? What would prove it wrong? He taught me that expertise is not the same as truth. An expert can be wrong. A textbook can be wrong. The only thing that really matters is whether the idea matches reality. And to find that out, you have to look at reality, not at authority. But most people aren't taught this way. Most people are taught to respect authority, to defer to experts, to believe what they're told by people with credentials. And that makes them vulnerable. It makes them easy to fool. Not by con men, necessarily, but by well-meaning authorities who are themselves fooled. Here's another thought experiment for you. Imagine you're a doctor. You've been trained in the best medical schools. You've learned all the latest treatments. Your patients trust you. And one day, a patient comes to you with a problem, and you prescribe a treatment that you believe in. Years later, it turns out the treatment was wrong. It was based on studies that didn't replicate. It was cargo cult medicine, looking scientific without actually being scientific. And in the meantime, you've been giving that treatment to hundreds of patients. How do you feel about this? Well, you might say, I followed the best evidence available at the time. I did what I was trained to do. It's not my fault the science was wrong. And that's true, as far as it goes. But it's also a kind of excuse, because maybe you could have questioned the science more carefully. Maybe you could have noticed that the studies weren't as solid as they seemed. Maybe you trusted the experts when you should have been skeptical. I don't blame doctors for this. The volume of medical knowledge is overwhelming. No one can read every study and evaluate every piece of evidence. You have to trust other people's judgments sometimes. But the danger is still there. The possibility of being fooled by people who have fooled themselves is always present. So what can we do about all this? How can we protect ourselves from our own minds? The first step is awareness. Just knowing that self-deception exists makes you less vulnerable to it. When you're making an important decision, when you're evaluating evidence, when you're forming an opinion, you can ask yourself, am I believing this because it's true? Or because I want it to be true? The question doesn't always have an easy answer, but asking it is better than not asking. There's a technique I use sometimes. Before I decide whether to believe something, I try to imagine how I would react if the opposite were true. If someone showed me evidence against my position, would I take it seriously? Would I change my mind? Or would I immediately start looking for reasons to reject it? If the answer is that I'd look for reasons to reject contrary evidence, that's a warning sign. That tells me I might be fooling myself. The second step is to seek out disagreement. Find people who think differently than you do and really listen to them. Not to argue with them, but to understand their perspective. If you only talk to people who agree with you, you'll never have your blind spots revealed. You need critics. You need skeptics. You need someone willing to tell you you're wrong. This is uncomfortable. Nobody likes being told they're wrong. Your ego gets bruised. You feel defensive. But those feelings are a sign that something important is happening. That discomfort is the feeling of your beliefs being tested. And beliefs that can't survive testing aren't worth holding. I try to actually seek out the strongest arguments against my positions. Not the weak ones that are easy to knock down, but the best, most thoughtful objections. If I can't answer those objections, maybe I need to revise my view. And if I can answer them, at least I understand my own position better. The third step is to make predictions. Before you evaluate evidence, write down what you expect to find. Then check how well your expectations matched reality. If you're constantly surprised by the data, it might mean your theories are wrong. And writing it down beforehand prevents you from rewriting your memory later. It prevents you from saying, "Oh yes, I expected that all along." The fourth step is humility. Not false modesty, but genuine uncertainty about what you know. Accept that you might be wrong about things you feel certain about. Accept that smart people before you have been confidently wrong about many things. Accept that you're probably wrong about something important right now, even though you don't know what. These aren't just scientific principles. They're principles for living. They're how you become a person who actually learns from experience rather than just confirming your prejudices. They're how you become someone who can change your mind when the evidence demands it. Let me tell you a story about changing my mind. Early in my career, I believed something quite strongly about how a certain physical process worked. I had good reasons. The mathematics seemed to support it. Other people agreed with me. I was pretty sure I was right. And then I met someone who disagreed. At first, I thought he was confused. I tried to explain why he was wrong. But he kept pushing back, kept asking questions I couldn't quite answer. And eventually, after much struggle, I realized that he was right and I was wrong. That was painful. I'd been publicly advocating for the wrong position. I'd written papers about it. People associated me with this view. Admitting I was wrong meant embarrassment and explaining to others why I'd changed my mind. But you know what? After the initial sting, I felt lighter. I felt free. I wasn't carrying around a burden of defending something wrong anymore. I could think more clearly because I wasn't twisting my thoughts to protect a mistake. Changing my mind was actually liberating. Now, I'm not saying this is easy. It's not. Every time I'm faced with evidence that contradicts something I believe, there's still that instinctive resistance. That voice saying, look for the flaw in the evidence. Don't give up so easily. Sometimes that voice is right and the evidence really is flawed. But sometimes it's just my ego trying to protect itself. Learning to tell the difference is a lifelong project. I want to leave you with a final thought. There's something beautiful about not knowing. I can live with doubt and uncertainty. I think it's much more interesting to live not knowing than to have answers which might be wrong. Most people are afraid of uncertainty. They want firm ground. They want to be sure. But certainty is a trap. When you're certain, you stop looking. You stop questioning. You stop learning. The moment you become absolutely sure of something is the moment you become vulnerable to being wrong about it. Doubt is not weakness. Doubt is strength. It takes courage to say, I don't know. It takes even more courage to say, I was wrong. But that's how you get closer to the truth. That's how you avoid fooling yourself. There's an old story about a king who wanted to know the truth. He surrounded himself with advisors who always told him what he wanted to hear. They praised his decisions. They agreed with his ideas. Life was comfortable. The king felt smart and appreciated. But the kingdom was crumbling. Problems that could have been solved early became disasters because nobody told the king about them. Opportunities were missed because nobody challenged his assumptions. By the time the truth became impossible to ignore, it was too late. Now, that's just a story, but it happens in real life all the time. Businesses fail because the boss doesn't want bad news. Relationships collapse because people don't want to have hard conversations. Scientific fields stagnate because nobody questions the established views. The truth is, having people who will tell you when you're wrong is one of the most valuable things in the world. Those people are uncomfortable to be around. They make you feel bad sometimes. They challenge your comfortable assumptions, but they might save you from disaster. So, cultivate those relationships. Find the people who care enough about you to tell you the truth. Listen to them, even when, especially when, it hurts. They're not your enemies. They're the only thing standing between you and your own mind's capacity for self-deception. Science, at its best, is a way of thinking that embraces doubt. It says, I believe this, but I might be wrong. Here are the reasons I might be wrong. Here is how we could find out. Let's look and see. Now, it's not a perfect shield against self-deception. Scientists fool themselves all the time, as I've told you. But it's the best method we have. It's the only method that has let us fly to the moon, cure diseases, understand atoms, and see to the edge of the universe. And it all comes back to that first principle. You must not fool yourself, and you are the easiest person to fool. So be careful, be honest, be humble, question everything, especially yourself. And remember, the planes only land when you actually understand how to call them down, not when you're just going through the motions. I'd love to hear from you. Tell me about a time you caught yourself believing something just because you wanted it to be true. What happened when you realized it? Write it down and share it.